Hi everyone, welcome to Immigration and Jobs Talk Show. I'm Rajni Bharara, your host, and before I move ahead, let me very quickly read out this very important disclaimer by watching our videos. You agree and understand that the information provided by our experts and attorneys, including comments and replies from users, is not legal advice. Use of information is at your own risk. All right, after this very important disclaimer, welcome back everyone to Immigration and Jobs Talk Show. I'm your host Rajni Bharara, and today we are diving into a timely and relevant topic, especially as we are on the cusp of a pivotal US presidential election. The upcoming election could dramatically reshape US immigration policies, making it more crucial than ever for startup founders, entrepreneurs, and tech innovators to understand their visa options. For many, the H-1B has been the traditional route, but as we know, that path can be limited. So today we are exploring alternatives and uncovering solutions that might be better suited for startup founders looking to build their vision here in the United States. I'm thrilled to introduce our guest, Alyssa Hussein, who brings a wealth of expertise and insight to our discussion. Alyssa is a business and employment based immigration attorney who represents companies and individuals seeking temporary or permanent legal status in the US through employment, trade, or investment. Her background is impressive. She has experience working with multinational technology companies, growing firms, and innovative startups. Alyssa's approach is all about strategizing with clients, guiding them through each stage. See, I'm so excited to introduce you that I've started fumbling. So I'm really sorry about that. So Alyssa's approach is all about strategizing with clients, guiding them through each stage of their immigration journey with dedication and passion. She earned her honors Bachelor's of Arts from the University of Toronto, majoring in gender studies, political science, and history, and holds Juris Doctor degrees from both the University of Windsor's Faculty of Law and Detroit Mercy School of Law. Licensed in Michigan and Ontario, Alyssa has handled complex immigration cases across Canada, the US, the Middle East, and Asia. Her work has spanned roles on the US immigration team at Deloitte with boutique firms specializing in startups, and now she's leading her own practice focusing on TNs, H-1Bs, O-1s, EB-1s, and NIWs, which is national interest waivers. So without any further ado, let me not fumble anymore and welcome Alyssa Hussein on Immigration and Jobs Talk Show. So Alyssa, very warm welcome to Immigration and Jobs Talk Show. This is your first time. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling good. Thank you for the very warm welcome. I'm excited to be here and excited to kind of share as much knowledge as I can.
Right. And, Alyssa, this topic is pretty unique and a little different than what we usually do. So what do you think? What can people, what would you like to say? What can people expect from today's episode?
Yeah, I think there's, a common perception that in order to work in the US, to gain permanent residence in the US, that you need to have an employer who's willing to hire you and sponsor you. And the purpose of today's presentation is to focus on kind of taking control of your own immigration journey, and especially for those who want to be entrepreneurs and run their own companies and also take control of their immigration journey into their own hands instead of being tied to employers, which for many immigrants, especially born in certain countries, including India, those wait times, those like dependence on your employer can be very challenging in terms of making life decisions. And so, yeah, I hope that this information is helpful in the sense of being able to recognize that there are other alternatives available, and kind of taking control of your own immigration journey.
Right. So, being an entrepreneur in your own country is so difficult because being an entrepreneur and starting your own startup, it's a difficult path than usually opting for a job because that's the most conventional way, right? And this is a little different than what usually people do. But if then trying to make it in a different country, in a foreign land, it must be so much more difficult than the normal path, right? So, what kind of cases have you handled? Let me just start with that. And how difficult is it for people to actually make it into a foreign land and build a successful business or a startup?
Yeah. I actually think that, I'm obviously biased, but I think that my foreign founder clients are, because they have so much more to navigate in terms of not only are they starting a company in the US, which is already challenging to begin with, they are, the odds are set against them in having to additionally handle US immigration, which has a further impact, right? When you're dealing with, fundraising and talking to investors, potential investors, you also need to be able to explain to them that you're not a risk, an additional risk, when they're doing their due diligence. So if anything, I think that foreign founders are the most equipped to handle, growing successful businesses in the US because they're just already faced with so much adversity in additionally having to navigate the US immigration side of things. In terms of the types of clientele I work with, it really ranges. I have people in tech, I have clients who have started retail companies. It really is so industry wide. It ultimately, which I think really allows for a lot of opportunity and really is focused on people's plans and career goals and what their long-term plans are. So I think that in some way it is, US immigration is very limiting, but on the other side of things, I actually think that it is also, there's like the world is your oyster in terms of what you want to pursue and how you want to pursue it. I think top advice I give to all my clients is as soon as you want to start your own company, I would say try and understand the US immigration side of things simultaneously while you're kind of thinking of your long-term strategies for your company, for yourself, and your long-term plans, because there is a way to align those. You just need to think strategically about it sooner than later.
Right, right. I mean, that's a great advice. But also, is it easy for a particular startups or a particular type of companies to make it, and in comparison to other kind of businesses, like maybe like you mentioned, tech companies? Is it easy for them in comparison to the ones who are making maybe getting into a restaurant business or
Yeah.
different businesses basically?
Yeah, I would say, there's no one route that's easier than the other. It again is very case specific. But in terms of for professionals, those who are kind of pursuing a tech company for the most part, there is an easier sell in the sense of it's less of an investment, right? You don't need to make as much purchases in physical premises, in inventory. So in terms of like the cost perspective that you would need to demonstrate to the US government that this is a real and operating company and that it will be, you need to show that you have put enough into it to demonstrate that it'll get there. And that's harder on the more brick and mortar side of things. But that doesn't mean it's not impossible. There's other routes. E2 visas are generally more recommended for restaurants and for more of the brick and mortar companies versus like an O1, but that doesn't mean it's not doable. It's just more challenging, but yeah, I think that answers your question.
Right, right. It does. It does. Thank you so much for getting into it and answering the question. Now, let me quickly, get into my questions that I've prepared for you. So, my very first question to you is: so, what key trends do you see in U.S. startup visa programs compared to those offered by other countries?
Yeah. So I obviously focus on US immigration, and most of my clientele are startups. I'm also licensed in Canada and am involved in some Canadian cases as well. I think the current climate of immigration, at least for the past 6 months, probably because of upcoming elections, because of economic, uh, in terms of economies kind of struggling right now, there seems to be a tightening of immigration, at least, when it comes to the US, when it comes to Canada. But that doesn't mean that, you can time the system and necessarily wait it out, because I think there's no way to really kind of figure out when is the best time to pursue US immigration, and even international immigration for that matter, when it comes to investments, because when you start your own company, everything's not going to align at once. I think it's really about paying attention to your company, what your goals are, and then using that to inform your decision about strategizing on the immigration front of things. So in terms of key trends, within the US, there's been, I think people are fearful of what's going to happen with the new administration and how matters are going to be adjudicated. And so there's been an influx in filing of cases. And so with that means that there have been more requests for more evidence. In terms of denial rates, I think I haven't in my own practice seen an increase. It still seems very, standard based off of what I've seen. But again, that's like, my sample size. But I do see immigration on the Canadian side of things where there are changes constantly happening, and it does seem like they are limiting immigration because there was in the past few years there's been an influx, and so they're trying to limit that. They also have an upcoming election as well, so these are considerations in terms of kind of how these programs are adjudicated or available. But on the US side of things, these programs don't really close down, right? Like the legal framework of temporary work visas and the green card routes are like have been available since the 90s. What changes is USCIS's guidance on how they're adjudicated, the reality of how they're adjudicated, and the types of evidence that can be used. So, particularly, we'll dive into this later in the section too, but in terms of for startups, USCIS has kind of broadened what, H-1B founders and O-1 founders can do to demonstrate that they meet the requirements so that they can sponsor themselves as a beneficiary through a company that they own. And their framework has allowed for this. However, that can change because of the political landscape or because of a change in administration. So these trends are, I think, always moving, but for the most part on the US immigration side of things have stayed fairly consistent. It's just how we need to document the eligibility that kind of has changed.
Right. So, but do you think, have you noticed that maybe the recent US policy changes has influenced, the attractiveness of the startup visa for international founders?
I don't know if it's just an increase also of people starting their own companies. I think there was some statistic, and I don't quote me on who published it or where it was from, but I think it was post-pandemic where people really did start to take control of their own, just like their own employment overall, and did start to pursue, entrepreneurship. And I think that with that also means that immigrants are part of that conversation. And as there is, an increase in investment, the US obviously wants that investment to be inside the US. And so as they kind of open up these programs and guidance on how they define the eligibility criteria, I think that has allowed for more startups to kind of pursue these routes with a little less challenge than they were met with before, because there was less clarity in the law. But that doesn't mean it wasn't happening. I think that USCIS has kind of moved with how the adjudications were going and provided clarity on this is permissible, to kind of make it more clear to founders that it is doable and that they likely will, so long as they meet the requirements and can demonstrate such that they will approve those applications.
Right. But then, also I would like to know, Alyssa, that do you think that there are specific sectors? I asked this question, but still I would like to know that, do you think there are specific sectors like maybe tech, biotech, where other countries are outspacing the US and attracting founders through their visa programs? Because we recently had an attorney from Portugal, and we spoke with her regarding golden visa, and then we also have golden visa in I guess Dubai, right?
Right,
So yeah. So do you think that is also happening?
I think that the US market is very unique. There's always, everyone's going to always want to enter the US market, even if these other countries are available. I think that for periods of time, the availability in these other countries may be, based off of people's life situations and their choices, that those may be options that they choose over going to the US. But I think that, it's one of America's, everyone just, not everyone, but there is always going to be this market of wanting to grow your company in the United States, to be able to kind of grow to that next level. So I say that to say that even while international countries are kind of opening up in their investment visas and even in their nomadic visas, for freelancers, as we've seen an increase in, especially since the pandemic, as people are moving abroad and wanting to live internationally and work remotely. I think that there is and will continue to be a US market for startups. And I don't know if the opening of those programs has necessarily impacted the US immigration side of things. But that's, again, just my opinion, right? Like that, yeah.
No, of course. People people can choose whatever countries, but they're always attracted to US. That's absolutely true. And
Yeah.
but then, could you provide like an example of a particular country that you feel that you must have noticed, notable success with startup visa program that you would want US to learn from?
That's a good question. I actually think that I'm not too well versed in the other programs, but it seems like for the most part, if you have sufficient funds, you can, they're kind of framed in that way that if you have sufficient funds, you're going to put that money at risk and purchase either a property or a business in these respective countries that is leading to a side of permanent residence or just residence in general. In those countries. And I think that there's also been some pushback from what I understand, again, not licensed abroad. But I think that the EU overall has been kind of looking into these programs specifically because there's some countries like Portugal that have opened up investment because of the nature of their economy and wanting to increase more international movement into their country. But then the rest of the EU isn't so open to those, everyone having access to those open borders. So I think that in some ways it's been working, but I feel like they're also kind of narrowing it down now in a way that is a little limiting. Whereas the US has just been fairly consistent. And if anything has made it a little bit more difficult, right? I don't handle too many EB-5s, but obviously like that pathway to an investment green card essentially is a very high threshold. It requires a large investment financially. But for the most part, most of the clientele that I'm dealing with are eligible for other work visas and even green card routes that don't require a huge financial investment. Those who can do it and generally and are eligible and have the funds available to do a 1.5 million plus investment, they will, right? That's the route that they're going to take. But I think that there are opportunities in the US based off of the current current work visas and green card routes that allow for little to no investment, but still a clear trajectory and plan of what that company and investment will be in the US, which is in some way an opportunity, but it is also very limiting because you need to meet certain eligibility criteria, right? Like for an O1 visa, it's great, but only if you can show that you're of what the USCIS defines as extraordinary ability. And sometimes that doesn't make sense in certain industries, right? Someone who is maybe pursuing retail or is pursuing a restaurant business may not have these particular awards and have earned this, a certain salary or have scholarly articles. Like it's very academic focused in terms of how it's been framed. So I think for those in tech or who come from a professional background, it does seem easier and that there are more routes available. Purely investment routes do require a little bit more of a financial commitment to have that opportunity in the US as well. But I do think, right, that if the US kind of lowers that requirement of what kind of investment is needed, it will open opportunity for more investment into the US. I just don't know if they're going to be open to that.
Okay, okay. I would also like to tell you, thank you so much for answering the question. A lot of people have also joined us and they are constantly posting their questions. If you can see,
Yeah.
let me quickly say hi to them. Dharmesh is here, Ishani is here, and I'm also getting questions on WhatsApp. So, hi guys, a big hi and a hello. To you. And thank you so much for your question. We'll be taking them in a bit. But before I take your questions, I would again like to tell you that we are live not just on YouTube, but also on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter. So make sure you subscribe to us. The handle is Immigration Talk Show. And yes, you can also, post your questions on these platforms too with, of course, YouTube. So we'll be taking your questions in a bit. But before that, let me again discuss a few questions with Alyssa. So Alyssa, you mentioned different visas. So now let's discuss those visas which are for startup founders. So what are the key differences between O1A visa, EB2 NIW, and EB1A visa for startup founders, and which one would you recommend for someone just starting their business in the US?
Yeah. I really like this question because I think it allows me to also clarify something where I think sometimes people have a common misconception is that green card routes are very different from temporary work visa opportunities. And so from the three that you listed, right, there's O1, which is a temporary work visa, and then EB2 NIW, which is the national interest waiver, and EB1A, for those of extraordinary ability, is an eligibility criteria for a green card. So when assessing which one to pursue, I think it depends again on the circumstances of the founder's situation, but ultimately the EB2 NIW and EB1A are more long-term plans. They don't provide any work authorization in the US. So if you are abroad and you're not inside the US and you've already started your own company, but you know you eventually want to grow into the US and you don't have so much of a quick timeline on your hand, an immediate rush to go to the US, then pursuing an EB2 NIW or an EB1A, depending on your eligibility and demonstrating that, which we can kind of dive into, is a good idea, especially for people who are born in India, because wait times are very long for green cards for Indian-born nationals, and it's based off of country of birth, unfortunately, not on citizenship. So even if you did become a Canadian citizen, that won't really open any opportunity for a shorter queue for the green card. So what you do by kind of getting to this sooner than later is you are locking in what's referred to as a priority date. And your priority date is what determines when you can eventually apply for your green card. So locking this in sooner than later shortens your wait time for eventually securing a green card. I say that to say that if you are, if you have if you need to be in the US immediately and you want to start working on your US based company, then you need to secure underlying work authorization, which includes an O1 visa. There are other work visas that are options as well, which can be H-1Bs, L1s, E2s. I think these are the four main ones that my startup clients will pursue in terms of underlying work authorization, while simultaneously either building up their profile to be eligible for an EB2 NIW or an EB1A, or pursuing that and submitting that application while they're growing their company inside the US. So in terms of which one is the best, it'll be very, case specific. I would say that, for people who aren't too familiar with the eligibility criteria, an O1A visa, you need to have a petitioner, which can either be your direct employer. It can be an O1 agent, which is a US citizen who kind of oversees your work and will be authorized by a lot of gig workers will use that.
Mm-hmm.
So they have like existing contracts and they freelance. And so the clients that they freelance with are willing to authorize this O1 agent to petition the O1 visa application for the individual. And then the third option is to have a US entity that you own petition you for your work, which is the startup founder route. You can, have a co-founder depending on your circumstances, or you can have a majority stake in the company as well. And there's certain requirements you need to meet to demonstrate an employer-employee relationship, which we can also dive into on this session as well, because I think that's the biggest crux of eligibility for these work visas that is specific to founders. But not only that, you then need to demonstrate that you are of extraordinary ability, which high level is, layman's terms may mean something different to everyone, but USCIS clearly identifies what those 8 criteria are. You need to meet a minimum of 3. And for different founders, for different industries, the types of evidence that we can kind of submit to demonstrate that you meet this criteria varies. Like I said, the regulations and the law is written in a very academic nature. So it's pointed towards, there's a criteria for scholarly articles, but someone who is in an entire, I'm trying to think, who's in retail, right? And in design, I mean, they may have written scholarly articles related to design and while they were in university or pursued academia, but for the most part, that's not the case. So really, it's about delving into what your industry is, the nature of your startup and your specific work, and then how you can use your experiences to date to demonstrate that you kind of have this corroborating evidence in those criteria. And so that's the O1A. In terms of the green card routes, then the O1A criteria is very similar to the EB1A criteria. Instead of 8 criteria, there's 10, 2 more that are related to arts. And it is a way higher threshold. For an EB1A, you don't need an employer to sponsor you, so you can self-petition. It is a first preference employment-based green card route, which also means that priority dates for green cards are a lot. It's a much shorter wait time, which is why they are very heavily sought after. But meeting the threshold for an EB1A is a very high standard. And so generally, based off of my client situation, we'll get them going on the O1 and we'll come up with a game plan of how to enhance their profile so that they're EB1A ready in the next year or 2, depending on where they're at with their application at that point. We kind of do an assessment. We work together and identify what is feasible with their career. Sometimes getting publications going takes a long time versus one of the criteria is peer review. So that requires less work in terms of having to sit and publish content, but it does require more networking and engagement in the industry. So we kind of strategize on what makes most sense because you're also creating and growing your startup at the same time. And so there's only so much you can do while also pursuing your goals, right? You get so focused on the US immigration side of things, and then your company fails because you're just so focused on that. So it's really an alignment of understanding this is a long-term journey, but it's doable, and it's really about being as targeted as possible in your approach. And then the EB2 NIW has been a great route. I think, again, for the last 6 months in adjudication for both EB2 NIWs and EB1As, there's been an influx of people just applying to get their foot in the door. And not all these cases are viable cases, unfortunately. And so it's kind of backlogging the system and making it difficult for people who actually have viable cases to get approved, and it is increasing RFEs. And so, but like I said, you can never really game the system and figure out a best time to apply. If you are in a position where you are eligible, I would say still go for it. Work with an attorney who knows what they're doing and will work with you on kind of presenting the best case, but be prepared to be met with potentially an RFE, to be met with a bad adjudicator who may deny, and you may need to refile or you may need to litigate. The system, unfortunately, is not the best system, but there are mechanisms to kind of eventually get there. It's just, you got to be committed. But the EB2 NIW, just like high level, is demonstrating that you're going to be pursuing a proposed endeavor. Technically, this endeavor doesn't need to be clearly defined, but it won't be approved if there isn't clarity on what it is. So you need to identify what your proposed endeavor is, and then on top of that, demonstrate that it is in the national interest of the US so that they can waive the labor certification process, which is the more classic employer sponsorship route for green cards. The EB2 NIW also allows for self-petition, so you are not tied to your employer, which allows for greater flexibility too. But there are like additional eligibility criteria, but just high level in terms of whether you're selecting to pursue the EB2 NIW versus the EB1A. EB1A has a higher threshold. Most people who will pursue EB1As are primarily Indian borns, because for an EB2 NIW, if you are eligible, wait times for a green card aren't ridiculous, and you will, be likely eligible in the next few years to be able to either adjust your status or get a green card. So, and if you did pursue the O1 or any other of the startup visas, be it through an L1 or an H-1B, you likely have at least 2 to 3 years of work authorization while you're waiting out for your priority date from your green card to be current.
Right, right. And also in cases like these, the role of the right kind of attorney for you also comes into play, right? You should have the right attorney to help you with your case, right? So guys, if you're looking for an attorney, and if you have a startup and if you want to get a visa and if you're looking for an attorney, so you can get in touch with Alyssa. Here are her details. You can email her on info at crossingfrontiers.ca, info at crossingfrontiers.ca. I want to spell it right so that people can note it down. And also, you can also please visit our website, which is www.crossingfrontiers.ca. Yes, do visit our website, and also you can write to her. You can email her. And now, Alyssa, so thank you so much for that detailed answer. So I would also like to know for you, for founders who are early in their careers, so which visa option would you recommend for them, so that they can that would offer them the most flexibility to pivot or expand their ventures?
Yeah, I think it is, like I said, of the main four, the go-tos, it really is dependent on, the nature of how they're kind of developing this startup in the US. And then there's also some like case specific based off of nationality for the E2, for example, versus if this is an intra-company transfer where someone has their startup that they started abroad and are now bringing to the US. So those are all considerations, but I'd say high level, like the pros and cons of the four, I can kind of go through those. Like for the O1, a huge benefit is that, there's no limit on how many times you can extend. You first can get up to 3 years, and then technically every time you request an an extension, you can only get one additional year each time. But if something major has changed in the trajectory of the company, we can kind of file this as a new employment. And so we can request 3 years on an ongoing basis with that. So the benefit of an O1 is that you're not limited in number of years like you are with many of the other visas, including H-1Bs and L1s, which are limited to 6 years for an H-1B and then 7 years for an L-1A or 5 years for an L-1B, which can be quite limiting. That time goes by so fast. So that's a benefit of the O1. A downside is that your spouse doesn't get work authorization from you having an O1 visa. They would have an O3, which has no employment associated with that. They would need their own employment visa in order for them to be eligible to work. And that is quite limiting for some families who both spouses do work. In terms, again, another limitation of the O1 is demonstrating that you're an extraordinary ability and that you meet that criteria. But I do find that many founders actually do not realizing that initially. So I would say, do your research, look online at the criteria, the 8 criteria. You probably will check off at least 2 based off of, think deep about it, about your portfolio, about things that you've done to date. And most clients, when they come to me, at a minimum, have at least 2. And then we kind of work on pulling their profile together, seeing if we can kind of reach a 3rd or a 4th, or, I give them like a 3 to 4 month time frame. And I'm like, okay, focus on these ones and then come back and we'll reassess. So that can be limiting because you need time to do that and you need authorization to grow your profile if you're in the US. So you need a backup visa or something else that's keeping you inside the US if that's your plan and you need to start working immediately. So that is a limitation. In terms of H-1Bs, they are beneficial in that you don't need to demonstrate this extraordinary ability. As long as your role is in a specialty occupation and that you will be paid the prevailing wage and you can demonstrate that need, then it's sometimes easier to meet that criteria as a founder where you are quite early stage and haven't built up your portfolio so much. However, there's limitations to this. You need to be able to have enough funds to pay yourself the prevailing wage. For the O1 visa, there's no minimum amount that you need to pay yourself. Generally, we recommend, obviously, making sure you're compliant with local employment laws and all of that. But, you can pay yourself a larger portion through equity. And that can kind of, offset paying yourself a little less and demonstrating to USCIS the nature of your work, which is very common for founders. So the limitation of the H-1B is that you are, the Department of Labor has to, approve, and you need to demonstrate that you're going to be paid at least the prevailing wage of your occupation based off of your geographic area, which can be quite limiting. But there are strategies around this. Instead of submitting a full-time H-1B petition, you could submit a part-time one where you'll pay yourself hourly and within a range of hours that you disclose in your application. So some clients will do that. They'll start off only working 5 to 10 hours a week as they're growing their business, and then they will add on longer periods of time or switch to a full-time H-1B once they have sufficient funds for that. Like I said, a downside of the H-1B is you're limited to 6 years. Time spent outside the US can be recaptured into that 6 years. With one exception, under AC 21, if you meet any of those requirements, you can extend beyond the 6 years, but that is if you are pursuing a green card route. The other thing is that spouses cannot work, H4 spouses cannot work unless you have an approved I-140, which is the green card pathway, and then that will allow for work authorization for H4 spouses, which, again, pro or con, right? Another pro of the H-1B is that it's a dual intent visa. So for most US temporary work visas, they are non-immigrant intent, except for O1s. They're kind of quasi non-immigrant, quasi dual intent, but the rest of them, like TNs, H3s, these are all non-immigrant intent, which means that you cannot have the intent to permanently immigrate to the US. However, H-1Bs and L1s are dual intent. So if you have a pending adjustment of status for your green card, that won't implicate your intent issues with your underlying work authorization. So there's some benefit to that as well. And then in terms of L1s, so that's like, again, very case specific. You need to, high level, there's more eligibility criteria to it, but you need to have worked for your foreign startup, or it doesn't have to be a startup, your foreign company that you own abroad for one full continuous year in a managerial or executive capacity for an L1A. And then you open up your US operations and you keep your foreign operations going. And so you have hired a team out there who's running the foreign operations, and then you start up the US operations, work for it for one continuous year in a managerial capacity or executive capacity as well. That not only gets you a work authorization, which is the L1 visa, you also may be eligible for the EB1C, which is a green card route, which is like the EB1A is a first priority. So it's a good strategy for some Indian-born nationals to kind of take this route towards a green card that may be more plausible with their long-term plans. So sometimes that's a strategy too for founders. If you are willing and open to starting your operations abroad first and then coming to the US, then that's a route as well. I would say L1s are very USCIS kind of digs deep into them. You need to demonstrate the eligibility criteria. Our fees are very common. It's better if the individual moving is a professional in some capacity. The nature of their work will be professional. Doesn't mean it's not doable for others in terms of like a restaurant. It just is a little bit more challenging. You need to demonstrate more. USCIS asks for more supporting evidence for that. And then for the most part, you need to be able to demonstrate ability to pay, unlike for the O1. So you need to show that there's funds in the company that can pay you. And then for the EB1C, especially, that you will be able to pay yourself up until you get your green card. So you do need enough funds, which can be limiting. But an L1, like I said, is a dual intent visa, so that's good. Spouses get an open work permit based off of the primary applicant having an L1, so that's a benefit as well, because if your spouse will be working, then they're not tied to an employer except for to your startup, and probably just, dependent on their spouse, but that's another story. And then the next one is the E2 visa, which is a very common investment visa. And the limitation of it, well, there are a few, but the main limitation is that you need to be a citizen of a treaty national country. So you can look up the treaty countries. Canada is on that list, but India is not. But so a lot of people who have immigrated to Canada and have now attained their Canadian citizenship, which is a way faster process than it is in the US, can then do an investment into the US through an E2 visa. There's no minimum investment. Generally online, you'll read that people recommend $100,000 minimum. This is not a threshold that the US government has set. It's not a real threshold. I would say $100,000 plus is definitely a case that may be an easier sell to the government, but I've had successful cases where they've spent $15,000 to $20,000. Ultimately, you need to put the money at risk. You need to demonstrate that the company you're investing in, either through a purchase or through starting on your own, is going to be, you show your 5-year plan, your business plan, that you're going to, make some US hires, that you're going to be creating enough income that's more than just to support your family. And that's kind of the threshold you need to demonstrate. And in terms of the amount of investment, it needs to be substantial compared to the nature of your business. So if someone is going to be starting a trucking company and only investing $15,000, that doesn't make sense, right? You need a fleet. You need to demonstrate that you have purchased some of these, that you have a place that you're keeping them, and 15,000 isn't going to cover that. So that's not realistic. Versus someone who has a tech company that's just starting with one computer and this software that they're developing, 15,000 may be doable. So it's really about spelling out the nature of the company, what the long-term plans are. And then there's a component of sourcing the funds, which is a part of the E2 visa, which is important. So depending on, you can get funds from, I was going to say anywhere, not anywhere, but it could be gifted to you from a family member. It could be VC funding. Ultimately, you just need to demonstrate that the funds were given to the applicant or the treaty national company, and that those funds are now at risk and being spent on the business. So that's kind of how we focus on the sourcing of it. And then for E2s, another benefit is that your spouse can also work. So of the 4, spouses can work on L1s and E2s in terms of the dependent visas, and sometimes on H-1Bs, depending on people's green cards. But for O1s, they definitely can't. So these are all considerations based off of, everyone's, I guess, unique circumstances. So, yeah.
Right. Thank you so much for such detailed answer. Thank you so much for, explaining everything in detail. And that was really, really insightful, Alyssa. Thank you so much for that. So with that, I know a lot of people are waiting, and we also have to take the Facebook questions as well. But still, I would like to know one more question. So are there instances where a founder, might have initially opted for one visa, a type of visa, and then, after their business became successful, then they transitioned into and they opted for, a different visa?
Yeah. I've done a few of those. It's just all dependent on people's, situations. But like top of mind, would like a certain case stands out to me as someone who was on H-1B. They were a founder. They started on a part-time H-1B, and then they switched to an O1. And they did that because they were hitting their 6 years and they didn't have an approved I-140 at that point. So they were running out of time on their H-1B, and they wanted to, and then they were eligible for an O1. So during that time when they were building up their startup, on a part-time basis through their authorized work on their H-1B, they were profile building so that they could meet the O1 eligibility, so that they didn't have to leave the US for that 1 year and then come back and be reselected in the H-1B lottery. So it's very common. I think if anything, for the most part, I would say once someone is a founder and on an O1, They generally won't switch to a different one because at that point, you have a little bit more flexibility, unless, of course, someone is looking for work authorization for their spouse or certain circumstances based off of, if they have travel and they want to be on a dual intent visa while their green card's pending, then they'll kind of consider something else. But I'd say most founders, once they're on that O1 route, they're now focused on their green card application and know that they'll continue extending their O1.
Right, right. Okay. Thank you so much again for answering the question. Now, let me quickly move to our audience's question. So, Kalpesh is here from LinkedIn and he says, interesting. Thank you so much, Kalpesh, for your comment. Let us know if you have a question, if you would like to know anything. Please post your question in the comments below and we'll be more than happy to take it. So, let me start with Dharmesh's question. Dharmesh says, for founders seeking an E2 or L1 visa, how do you assess if the business and investment actually meet the minimum substantial or qualifying thresholds required?
Yeah. So
we also have
sorry.
a part two. I'm so sorry. We also have a part two, and he says, "Are there common misconceptions about what substantial investment means?" Okay, let's start with the first question.
Yeah. So in terms of substantial investment, that's required for the E2, not for the L1. But for the E2, like I said, I think we kind of did touch on this later on after Dharmesh posted his question. But basically, the investment needs to be the argument needs, we need to be able to demonstrate that the amount you're investing is reasonable and substantial for the nature of your business. So we would really, demonstrate that through pulling your business plan, looking at what you have already spent on, and then the nature of your business. So if all you really need to spend in the next year is on marketing, and that's reasonably a few thousand, then we would demonstrate that that would still be that's all that is really needed for your company, because the product is already developed. It's already been, it's really, there's not much more financial investment that needs to go in order to sell to clients. But again, like I said, if you have more inventory and you need it for the nature of your business, then we need to show that that money is substantial for what it is. So there isn't a clear definition. It's about arguing to the officer why this investment amount is substantial compared to the nature of what you are going to be doing in the US. And then for the L1, there isn't a requirement of how much you need to pay yourself. Usually, if it's on the lower end, officers will question, how true and operating your company is if you're not paying yourself a reasonable amount. But for the L1, the focus is more on demonstrating your qualifying relationship between the foreign office, the US office, and then specifically with your managerial or executive role abroad and in the US, or specialized knowledge. So the focus then is on including evidence that shows that you have proprietary knowledge, or that you were leading a team, or you led a function of the organization. So that is kind of how that will be documented.
Okay. So Dharmesh, I hope you have got your answer. In case you have a follow-up or anything else that you would like to know about, please continue posting your questions. We'll be more than happy to take it. Okay, so Lasha is also here from Facebook, and he says, I'm already in the USA. I have a work in social. Can I still participate into green card lottery? And if I win, do I have to leave the country?
I actually don't deal with too many of the diversity lottery. I think he's talking about the diversity lottery green card, which I think just opened up last month. Don't quote me on that. I don't handle too many of those. So I won't be able to answer this specifically, but I would say kind of reach out to an attorney who does handle. I know that there's quite a few attorneys who specifically also only handle the diversity visa green card. So, like Rajni said, I think the focus on finding a U.S. immigration attorney is really, dependent on their area of expertise, which is unfortunate because you want someone to kind of assess all of your options. But some of us are very, I am very experienced in working with startups specifically and within these various routes. And so I don't do so much of the diversity visa green cards, unfortunately.
But Lasha, we do have a lot of shows with a lot of attorneys on our channel, so you can, definitely subscribe to our channel, and we'll be bringing a lot of shows, and you can, ask your question, and we'll definitely ask one of our experts, and we'll reply to your question. But thank you so much for posting your question. We'll be replying to your question after asking to it from an expert. Now let me quickly take Ishani's question. So Ishani is also here from YouTube, and Ishani says a startup client is considering acquiring a US based company with existing employees on various work visas. What are the key immigration related due diligence considerations and potential risks we should assess to ensure a smooth transition?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You should definitely engage with a U.S. immigration attorney to make sure that prior to purchase, because you want to make sure that you've kind of done all your due diligence, which obviously you're trying to do as well. I would say focus on making sure that you have access to all the petitions that the US based company submitted on behalf of the employees. So you understand the commitment based off of financial commitment in terms of length of period of stay, if there's pending green cards. And then you also want to make sure that you do your I-9 and E-Verify compliance as well. If they have been compliant, for them to provide that documentation to you. And if they haven't, that you make sure you engage with an attorney so you can set up a system internally so that you can make sure you're compliant moving forward, and you can demonstrate that and paper trail that. Also, when you do the purchase, depending on the nature of it, whether it's a merger or acquisition, the nature of the employees' work visas, you may need to disclose this to USCIS just to let them know that there's been a change in ownership, but that's very case specific. So again, I'd recommend kind of engaging with an attorney to go through that with you, because you want an attorney's eyes on those, an immigration attorney's eyes on those petitions prior, ideally, to you purchasing over a commitment for foreign employees.
Okay. So, Ishani, I hope you have got your answer. In case you have a follow up, please also post it. And thank you so much for your question. And okay, so Lasha is also back, and he says, thank you so much. Of course, we are here to provide you information and provide you help. So, thank you so much for being here. And let me quickly take Yuri's question now. And Yuri says, how do you evaluate the potential of visa options like the O1 or E2 compared to the H-1B in terms of aligning with the startup's long-term goals? And then there's one more question. Then after you answer this, we'll be taking that.
Okay. Yeah, no, this is literally where I start off with my clients, right? If high level, they've consulted with me and we kind of know that they're potentially eligible for an O1 or an E2 and an H-1B, then we unpack what makes the most sense based off of their plans. So if they already meet a lot of the O1 criteria, and then sometimes my recommendation would be to pursue that over an E2, because you don't have to put the money at risk yet. But if the nature of them, the startup, is that they're purchasing a company and the money's at risk anyway, then that may be the better route, because eligibility is for a longer period of time. If they do get married, or if they already are, then their spouse has that option. H-1Bs are usually only applicable to people who have previously been selected in the H-1B lottery, or are like simultaneously working with a cap exempt organization. So sometimes that's a limitation. And then at that time, I also want to know what long-term plans are. Do you want to pursue a green card? What are your plans? Do you want to change up your company? Are you going to start up a few companies? That's very common in the industry. And so how do we kind of want to frame your narrative for your green card application while you're pursuing your work option? So we kind of talk through that, and I try to understand your long-term goals and align that with what makes the most sense with the various temporary work options based off of that. And then also based off of adjudication at the time, right? E2 visas are not adjudicated for the most part by USCIS. They're adjudicated by the consulate office. So you're going in for an interview and someone's deciding on the spot whether you're eligible or not, versus an officer in USCIS who sits and goes through your documentation for days, right, or hours, and is really looking at everything very in depth. And so sometimes a strategy would be going to a consular office versus submitting it at USCIS, and there's strategies around that too. So it is all basically, I say, short answer is it depends on your long-term goals and the nature of your investment and what you're trying to do in the US.
But and so what if they don't have long-term goals? They're looking for, like quick advice or instant advice for just that moment. So how do you manage that?
Yeah, I mean, I go into my consultations being like, do you eventually want a green card? Because if we need
Okay.
to assess that. But in terms of if
I think
that,
mostly
if
everyone
someone,
does, right?
sometimes a lot of Canadian citizens don't, because there's then tax implications of having a green card.
Yeah.
So, and the proximity and all of that too. Like, sometimes it's not the long-term plan. Sometimes people just want to work in the US for 4 or 5 years and then go back home to their home country. When people tell me that, I say, if you are eligible for a green card, you should maybe still apply and decide at that time if you want to proceed with actually getting the green card versus not. Because, being eligible is, not too many people are. So if you want, that's a good opportunity to have. But again, very, very specific to the situation. But I would say, in terms of evaluating, I do on consultations, I will do like high level of collecting as much information through our conversation as possible and giving you my high level advice on what makes the most sense. I would say, in terms of the O1, E2, H-1B, like I said, there's all the pros and cons I listed previously, and it'll depend on, do you want to have to pay yourself a certain amount, right? With the H-1B, do you want to put those funds at risk for the E2? Do you meet the eligibility criteria of the extraordinary ability for the O1? So if you meet all three of those, then it's a strategy of, okay, which one has better adjudication? Which one are you currently most prepared for? And likely, I'd say if you meet all three of those, the E2 is probably the better option, assuming you meet all three of those criteria. And of course, this is just, with as little information as possible on the circumstances.
Okay, and her next question is actually on the tax implications. So she says, please do discuss potential tax implications for investor visas. Also outline the application timeline and required documentation.
Okay, so in terms of tax implications, I am not a tax attorney or a tax professional, so I would recommend, because it's very specific based off of your home country and any tax treaties. So I would very much recommend that you speak to a tax professional on that. Like I said, there are tax implications for becoming a green card holder in the US, in that giving up your green card in the future or your US citizenship in the future for tax purposes. So, because the difference with the United States, this is, again, I'm an immigration attorney, not a tax lawyer, but just in terms of informationally, the difference with the United States versus other countries is, if you move abroad, you still have to pay taxes to the US government. So sometimes people will have, made a change in plans and they want to retire in a different country, and they're still paying taxes to the United States. And so they may want to abandon their green card or their citizenship for tax purposes. And when you do that, you are, when you abandon your citizenship, the US government will ask you if you're doing it for tax purposes. And then in the future, if you ever wanted to come back, that will implicate your US immigration journey and options available to you. So that's a consideration in terms of once you are a green card holder and or a citizen. In terms of for the visas, the work visas, that is different. You obviously, when you're working in the US, you have to pay US taxes. How that works with your home country and treaties will depend on where your residence is and based off of the nature of the country. So for that, I would say talk to a tax professional. In terms of I think this is about the E2, right? Outline the application timeline and required documentation. So documentation, for the most part, will vary based off of the nature of your business. I'd say high level, you need to be able to demonstrate that you have the formation documents, that you have the business plan, you have all of the source of funding documents, and then you need to demonstrate your eligibility, why you're best to kind of run this business, which could be your resume, supporting documents of previous work in the industry as well. And then for E2 timelines, they are specific to the consulate. So you submit E2 applications to the relevant consulate in Canada. That's in Toronto. They're the only ones that adjudicate the initial E2s. And the timelines vary, but generally what I've seen is that when you submit the application, you'll usually get an interview within about a month or two max. That can vary depending on how busy they are. And then once you go to your interview, if they approve your E2, they'll send you your passport within a week or two. So E2s, in terms of, I'd say the application preparation time is a lot longer, but once you submit it, it gets rolling a lot faster versus an L1 or an H-1B that get adjudicated with USCIS. And then if you need a visa, you need to go to the consulate or embassy and apply for that visa before you can enter the US. So timing kind of varies based off of your circumstances.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much for that detailed answer. Alyssa, Yuri, I hope by now you must have got your answer. Thank you so much for your question. Okay. So Alyssa, it's already one. We have crossed 1 hour mark, but if you have a little more time, we can discuss a few more questions because,
Okay.
I
I can do a few more minutes. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that. Let me quickly take Arjun Mehta's question. Arjun is also here and he says, what are the unspoken challenges of switching between visa types? For example, moving from F1 OPT visa to an O1 or an H-1B. Are there risk founders might not be aware of when they ladder through visa categories like this?
Mm-hmm. It'll depend on, again, it's very important that you work with a qualified immigration attorney who's experienced in these, because what we'll do is we'll review to make sure that you were maintaining status in your previous visa status when we change status to one of the other ones. If there's a potential gap, while you were in F1, you were unemployed for a bit, but you went beyond the permissible time, and that may raise a potential issue, then we may advise to do a consular process for your application versus a change of status from within the US. So it's very important to make sure that your immigration attorney that you're working with is reviewing your previous applications, your previous status, asking you those questions. And another thing to consider for F1 to one of the other visas is that F1 is a non-immigrant intent visa. You need to be able to demonstrate that you maintained your ties abroad. It won't usually come up at the change of status to another work visa, but it may come up at the green card stage. So you want to make sure that you are keeping documentation of your compliance of all your visas in the US. Documentation of that is keeping records of when you attended school, that you attended classes, while you were working, your pay statements, when you switch jobs, make sure you just download them and save them somewhere so that when you're applying for your green card in the future, if any of those things are questioned, you don't need to then go back to your old employer. You already have it all saved. And if there were any gaps in employment, that you demonstrate the exact dates and documentation that demonstrates that, so that you can demonstrate that you were within appropriate grace periods and that you timely filed your next application. So that's high level, but again, it's very case specific. Biggest recommendation I give to everyone is keep documentation of your whole US immigration journey, no matter what. It may never come up. You may never need to give it to you at CIS, but it's just the best way to be prepared for any potential questions.
Right, absolutely. And guys, if you want to get in touch with a good attorney for your case, so we have it right here. So you can get in touch with Alyssa. Her details are scrolling below, and also right there on screen. You can note it down. info@crossing frontiers.ca. You can write to her on her email, and you can also visit her website, which is www.crossingfrontiers.ca. Let me quickly take Rohit's question also. Rohit says, I've heard that national interest waivers and NIW can be used for founders, but what does a startup need to demonstrate in order to genuinely show national benefit or interest? Is there any practical guidance you can give on the merit of a tech startup here?
Yeah, so it'll really be about documenting the genuineness of your proposed endeavor. So letters of intent of potential clients you're going to work with, or if you already have clients for your startup because you have work authorization to work for your startup, including those. Including, for companies that are quite early stage, haven't really taken off the ground yet, I would definitely recommend including a business plan that clearly demonstrates what you're going to be doing in terms of staffing projections, financial projections. That's not on the national interest component, that's on the proposed endeavor component to show the genuineness of your company. But in terms of the national merit, the national interest component, you will really need to identify the market that you're going to be in, the types of clientele. So I'd say if you're in the semiconductor industry, and that's an industry that USCIS has like clearly, loves for national interest. There's a lot of supporting evidence in that. So you won't need to, the argument will be a little bit easier in terms of demonstrating the national interest versus someone who, is in real estate and in one geographic area, and you could be probably in affordable housing, and that is a national interest argument, but is it siloed to one geographic area? Is it national? So it's really, really, for national interest waivers, the good and bad thing about it is that it's not definable. It's really about how you demonstrate to USCIS the impact of the work you're going to be doing and demonstrating that it is in the national interest of the US. And so that can vary based off of the nature of your work and the nature of your startup.
Okay, okay. Thank you so much again for that answer, Alyssa. And thank you so much, Rohit, for your question. I hope you have got your answer. In case you have a follow-up, continue posting it in the comment section. And whenever we get Alyssa back for an episode 2, we will be taking that question maybe on in that episode. For now, Alyssa, I'll take a few more minutes, maybe 5 more minutes or 2-3 more minutes, if that's okay for you. I would like to share my screen and show those Facebook questions. I would also like to get an answer to those Facebook questions. So
Okay.
I think I'm already sharing my screen. I don't know why am I not able to show it. I would like the control to help. Okay, it's here. Okay, so let me take it from the top. It's just posted 1 hour back, and let me zoom my screen a bit. So this anonymous participant says, trying to figure out where to schedule an H4 visa appointment for my spouse. Is Islamabad Consulate Embassy still conducting these interviews for first time? Okay, I think this is for Pakistan. But then here is one question from Hari Krishnan, and he says, if I book Dropbox appointment in Chennai, can I submit documents at Bangalore drop-off location? So is it
Yeah.
possible? Uh-huh.
I would say for all the consular related questions, because they're so specific to each consulate, each consulate does things differently based off of location. So at a minimum, what I'd recommend is they have their email addresses posted and their phone numbers for the most part. So reach out to them, and you can also specifically ask. And otherwise, your attorney should be able to answer this question, because if they are providing consular processing support as well. But each consulate is different. Things change on an ongoing basis. So I would recommend reaching out to the consulate.
Okay. I think that's a great answer. Thank you so much for that. And then there is this one more participant who says, hi guys, the salary mentioned in LCA is different from what is mentioned in the offer letter. So which one to tell when the visa officer asks for the interview about salary?
Yeah, I mean, this is very case specific. I'd want to look at the whole petition to make sure that what was disclosed is the offer letter's salary higher than what's been disclosed in the LCA. At a minimum, you need to, if it's drastically different, you need to be able to, you likely haven't disclosed to USCIS the actuality of your petition. So you may want to file an amendment of the LCA. Sometimes what I recommend for clients, especially for startup founders who don't know how much they'll be paying themselves, is to put a range, so that way, if you end up paying on the lower end of the range, or if you eventually want to pay more, you have that wiggle room. At a minimum, you need to be paying above the prevailing wage. So I would, if you are going to the interview and you are going anyway, I would make sure that the offer letter salary is higher than the prevailing wage for the specific role and the location, which likely is the one in the LCA.
Okay. Thank you so much for that answer. And then there is one more participant who says, hello, everyone. I took 10 months of break due to health issues and did not travel to USA on H1. I have H-1B valid till October 2025. Will it be any issue at immigration? And from past 3 months, my pay stub did not generate.
If you're outside the US, you don't have any obligation to be paid. USCIS only has jurisdiction on your work authorization while you are on US soil. Did not travel to the US on H1, so any of that time you were not using your H1 time, you don't need to demonstrate that you were being paid during that time.
Okay. Okay. So after this, let me take maybe one more question for today's show, and then maybe we can wrap it up. So this participant says, "I just appeared today, 4th of November, for consular interview at Chennai, and my visa H-1B was approved, but I have not received any blue slip from the lady who took my interview. Is it normal? And any idea by when can I expect my passport? I selected VFS Delhi for delivery. Please, if anyone can provide clarification, I'll be grateful."
Yeah,
Going to
I mean, again, dependent on
salary.
consulates.
Mhm.
Yeah, but for the most part, I'd say unless you're put into administrative processing, which they may do afterwards too, even though they said it's approved, it could still happen. That may delay the process, but for the most part, once it's approved, you'll generally get your passport within a few weeks. And then if you don't within a few weeks and you haven't heard anything about administrative processing, then I'd recommend reaching out to the consulate to touch base on when you should expect it.
Okay, okay. Thank you so much for those answers, Alyssa. I would really like to take more questions, but unfortunately, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for extending the time too. And thank you so much for being here. And, it was a great episode. And thank you so much for that great debut on Immigration and Jobs Talk Show. And for our audiences, I would like to say to get in touch with Alyssa, you can email her. Her email ID is info@crossingfrontiers.ca. I would like to read it. info at crossingfrontiers.ca. Yes, that's our email. And you can also visit our website, which is www.crossingfrontiers.ca. Thank you so much again for being here, Alyssa. There were so many questions still pending, and we were not able to cover all of them.
Yeah.
So, if you're okay, we would love to have a second part to this episode.
Yeah, I would love to do that. I like this, and I think that the more targeted questions we get, as people are more informed too, then we can kind of unpack them more in detail as well. So I'd be happy to do another session. But I had a lot of fun doing this. I love talking about U.S. immigration for startups. So this was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that, for those kind words. And we are going to see you very soon, and we are going to, schedule the show. We'll check your availability for a second episode. And thank you so much again for being here. And your answers were insightful, detailed. So thank you so much for being so elaborate and so detailed with your answers. Thank you so much again
Yeah,
for being here.
absolutely. Thank you.
Guys, that's it from our side for today's webinar. We are going to see you very soon with an episode 2 of this webinar, and we are going to have Alyssa back soon. But until then, you guys keep on watching and keep on subscribing to Immigration and Jobs Talk Show. I'm Rajni Bharara signing off for now. Take care and keep subscribing and keep watching Immigration and Jobs Talk Show. Bye for now.